Hey everyone, I'm so excited today to bring you my special guest who has a story that's never been told before. 50 years in the making. My guest was around some very serious mob guys, and he has some great stories that I know that all of you are going to like. We're talking everything from betrayals to mob hits to mobsters in prison running scams to the mob bosses themselves. And then at the end, where my guest had to leave town because of the mob. You don't want to miss today's show. And without further delay, on to the rest of our presentation. So, how are you doing today? My guest is Mike Rakowsky.
Good, James. I appreciate being here with you. I'm excited to get the chance to finally tell these amazing stories.
Yeah, I'm excited too, and I just want to let everyone know that I've been working with Mike. We've been working together on this show for about a month. And I think that it's just been really amazing, as I've dug deeper and deeper into this, it just becomes even more amazing, and it really I like how everything pulls together. But, we're talking the Patriarcha family. And I know we don't talk a lot about them on this show, but I think that folks need to realize how powerful the patriarchas were, especially during the day of Raymond L.S. Patriarcha. He was not someone to mess with, and he was as powerful as any of these bosses in New York. And so I just think that folks need to hear this story, and I think they'll enjoy it. So, Mike, how are you doing though?
Pretty good, pretty good. Thanks. And yeah, I'm glad to be able to get this out. I think you're right. I think in some ways, of course, all the media attention in New York, but I think Raymond is underestimated. But when you look at it, and this goes into the NPRA part of it too, but he
Hmm.
he had a scope of 5 states from Maine all the way down through Connecticut, and over quite a period of years.
Yes.
And and as you said, he defended that by being ruthless. But the stories we have to share today really focus in on that part and what happened and what led me to end up in Arizona.
Yeah, most definitely. And so, as we get started, I'd like you to could you let the folks know who you are, kind of, just a quick, synopsis of your life, and then maybe talk about how in the world did you even get started, get around these mob guys? You weren't a street guy yourself. You're not a person that was involved too much in the rackets and all of that, but you definitely got in the middle of all this. So I'd love to hear about your story growing up just a little bit, and then let's go into how you got started in all this and getting around these guys.
I did. I appreciate it. I did, and no, I was. I had led a relatively comfortable life, and was blessed to get a great education, fantastic high school education. Ended up getting an early admission to Brown University, which is one of the best universities in the country. And
Mhm.
not only that, but I landed there with college credits. So academically, I was in good shape, and I'm blessed to have had that education. But I really wanted to know. I was curious to know about the real world,
Yeah.
and I really wasn't satisfied just with the academic side. And so I did a couple things. Number one, fantastic radio station in Providence there, WBRU-FM, 50,000 watts, very
Hmm.
progressive and all kind of stuff, really free flowing in those days. But I mean, 50,000 watts on a good day, they would knock a lot of the Boston stations off the air. It was so
Right.
powerful. So there was really a big audience, and so I got to be there and get into that, and that comes into play later because we made a special program for the prison. But
Right.
so that became significant. But then I came across a couple of people, Scott Harris and Barbara Hershey had started this outfit called the Jericho Society,
Yes.
and the idea was just to provide tutoring for inmates at the ACI, the American Arizona, the Correctional Institute in
Yep.
Cranston, just south of Providence, and uh, and it turned out they had started it, and they turned it over to Kathy Hoffman and myself, basically, and we had as many as 100 people a week, not at a peak, going in and out of the prisons, tutoring inmates, one-on-one tutoring. Because if you have educational difficulties,
Mhm.
it's very uncomfortable to be in front of people and expose your weaknesses, particularly if you're a big macho prisoner, right?
Yeah,
So the
exactly.
one-on-one tutoring concept was just perfect. So we're able to help guys get a leg up and maybe get their GED and keep them busy in a positive way. So it was really very good. And the first time we went there, I'd never been exposed to anything like that. As you said,
Right.
I had led a
Mhm,
different life,
mhm.
but you literally have to walk through the whole cell block and
Yeah.
it's your eyes get big, and then this guy Joe Dicenzo, big muscular guy in a tight shirt,
Yeah.
but he was really conscious about his stutter. But he was really a good guy. But you walk by the cell block, and then he said at night they just never shut up. You always have some idiot.
Oh.
And there's just all this noise. And
Mhm.
so some of these images stay with you. And he was sitting there. We're trying to understand this different world from us, and he's trying to figure out what our angle was. And
Exactly.
that's how it got started. But then as we got along, it was very positive. I was
Yep.
able to use that radio station because I was able to set up something called the ACI hour,
Yeah.
and they had the guys had a lot of time on their hands, and they had a print shop, and so they
Yeah,
printed
we're
this
talking about a
stationery.
prison radio station, right?
Yes.
And
No, no,
can
the
you what
radio
year
station was the radio
I'm sorry.
station was in Brown, but these
Right,
guys,
right,
the
understand that.
yeah,
Oh, you're talking about the one in Brown. So WBRU is
right.
a FM 50,000, watt radio station that was in Providence, and it was
Yeah.
was ran by Brown University, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it was based in Brown University, but it was
Yeah.
it was its own enterprise. And our station ID was WBRU-FM Providence.
What year are
Yeah,
we
good.
talking about? Just to let the folks kind of, know what time frame we're talking about right now, with
Okay, yeah.
so
This is
you're in yeah,
early. Yeah, I started Brown in 69. So it was
yep,
like 70, 71 till the mid 70s. And
yeah,
and what's interesting is,
mhm,
and we'll come back to that, but what's interesting is when I got involved, and you and I have talked about this,
mhm,
there are names that I saw, but I never met these guys because by the time I got involved, they happened to already have expired.
yeah,
And
exactly,
I had seen their names, but the stories and as you and I have figured out, what happened was there are these guys who are supposed to be the top level guys for
yeah,
Raymond Patriarca, and Willie and Rudy Morfeo, Anthony
mhm,
Melee, Raymond Curcio, a bunch of these guys, and they got to the point where they were disrespectful to the Godfather. Really
mhm,
questioned why the hell should they pay him money when they were running the business. And so what happened was Raymond decided it was time for a change, and in the mid to late '60s, he took up with a whole different bunch who wiped these guys out. And
yeah,
this was Nick Palmisano,
yeah,
Gary Ouimet. Very interesting, a guy named Maurice Pro Lerner, who was
mhm,
the pro really was who tried to be a pro baseball player,
yeah,
triple A. He was pretty good, but the pro was really he was a very special hitman for Raymond. And I
yeah,
met him, I spoke with him in the yard there. He was unlike most of these guys, he was very quiet, Jewish
mhm,
actually.
yeah,
And but he was kind of a health nut. He would run around the yard, need a special diet. All the rest of these guys were involved with the organizations, but he kind of kept to himself. But now
yeah,
to this day, his son has an incredibly successful injury law practice,
yeah,
accident law practice here in Phoenix, made millions
mhm.
of dollars. He never met his dad.
Oh, wow.
Never met him, and I've spoken with him, and I
Yeah,
assured him that I had met him, and from what this other gentleman said, I said, really, he was just an interesting character, but all these characters and all these stories are interesting in their own right,
yeah,
but uh, some of these guys. So what happened was that Raymond, the law enforcement came after him, and the funny thing was they all got busted for killing the other mobsters, right?
Mm.
I mean, they
Yeah.
weren't attacking the establishment or anything, but they ended up. That's why all these hitmen ended up in the penitentiary, right?
Yes. Mhm.
And what they did is they morphed from the streets, and they had a whole new concept where a lot of people miss this story. They had
Mhm.
because and another part that comes along is they had guaranteed private phone lines that
I
nobody was
know, that's just
listening on,
crazy to me,
which
the
you'd
thing.
never have that again, and you shouldn't,
No.
okay? I knew these guys, they should not have had them, but they
Yeah.
did, and it was my friend, Ralph Ben David, who filed the lawsuit that established that right. They had an absolute right to that phone, and they had a private office with the phone in it, and so they used that for medium and maximum security to run the whole thing. They ran the NPRA organization, but they
Yeah.
also had unfettered access to communications. Most people, he said, "Oh, they're all locked up. Oh, they're dead." No, they just morphed the whole thing. And Jerry Wilmette, who ran the operation at medium security,
Yeah.
would order pizzas and even alcohol and get the guards to bring it into him, you know? And so so they didn't have too bad a setup and they were able to run the and he had a phone as well. So these guys were operators.
Yeah, and I was going to tell you about, just to set the context for to understand about Patriarcha and what's happened in this time period. So, like I said, he was brutal and ruthless. He had a group of people around him that would just, they would kill on order. And I think a lot of you knew in the early '60s, you had the animal Barboza. He was a big one, but then he ended up turning. A lot of these guys that were around Patriarcha would get tired of him because Patriarcha was very greedy. I mean, he was ruthless. He ordered one of his mob guys to kill the guy's own son, and so that was one thing. Another time, there was a case where, uh, he had invested Patriarcha had put, I don't know, $25,000 into, like, a cigarette bootleg cigarette thing, and the feds ended up, hijacking the cigarettes, and the thing was is that everyone had invested in it, but Patriarcha demanded that everyone pay him back the $25,000 investment, even though everyone took that same risk. So he was just really brutal. I mean, at times he was friends with the Irish. I know he got in a war with the Mc- McLaughlin gang. There was just a lot that was going on. But in March of 1970, this was during your time period, what had happened was that Patriarcha went on trial, but several of his guys, so a lot of the guys that you were around, ended up going on trial for murder and conspiracy. And so there was a hitman he had named John Kelly. They called him Red. And the guy, he flipped. He went into the witness protection program, and Kelly actually had, when, testified that Patriarcha and the other guys had went after and killed, Rudy Morfeo and another guy, and basically Kelly
Anthony
was
Millay,
ready
yeah.
to kill the guy, and so they ended up, convicting Patriarcha and a guy named Maurice Lerner, and
As pro learner, yeah.
yeah, pro Lerner, and ended up getting 10 years in prison, but he continued to run things from the prison, and then in '75 he gets out. So basically, he's in there for 5 years, and this is when you're in that during your time frame, but he had, I think what had happened was is that this guy, Kelly, had actually lied about some of it. He worked with a corrupt FBI agent or something. I don't know the full story on that, but what I know is that basically he gets out in 5 years, but during this time period that you're there, he's running the family from prison. So I just wanted to
Right,
throw
and
all that
you see
out
that
there
Raymond
for.
learned Raymond learned, he said, "Look, these guys, were not loyal to me. I can't
Yeah,
count on them." And so he's got this whole new crew. Every one of them had killed for him. And
mhm,
yes, they initially went to trial with Patriarcha, but at the initial stages, nobody flipped on him. So Raymond ended up in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but
right,
he did not end up getting the state time. And as you said, ended up doing 5 times for God knows how many people he had hit. It's a joke,
yeah,
really. And as you say, they just underestimate. Well, other thing you and I talked about is, of course, they had
mhm,
these. Well, let me they established my friend Ralph Ben David was probably one of the most brilliant jailhouse lawyers there ever was.
yeah,
To
right,
this day, with the things he did are precedent in the whole country. And
right,
so they established, and then the conditions in the prison were disgusting.
yeah,
And so they went in there and they said, look, these guys are getting beaten up. They're emotionally and physically tortured. It's disgusting, this and that. And there was this judge named Raymond Patine. There's
mhm,
something called the Patine Rules. And this,
yeah,
for the first time in America, this judge said, of course, they're incarcerated, but these are still human beings. And so
mhm,
you cannot ignore that they have certain rights as human beings, and they put in a whole structure, and they ended up with the NPRA, and they ended up National Prisoners Reform Association,
yeah,
and they ended up with this setup where I used to go in this office up in the education area, and it
mhm,
was a private office. The phone was there. Nobody was listening to the phone. It was a dream. And
mhm,
so they had a great, but nobody understood just how they used that. But he had a bunch of guys there that he said, okay, now I've got, the number one thing is to protect the Godfather, right? To keep
yeah,
that deniability. And that's what plays into my story that we'll talk about in a little bit here, is that all of a sudden, here's this guy from Brown who
yeah,
who has direct knowledge of uh, of hits that are going out because of direct stuff with Raymond Patriarca,
yeah.
and I'm glad I'm here today to tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense, and then one thing I thought was interesting is so what you did, and I think I interrupt you when you was talking about the ACI hour. One of the things that so you're kind of doing this radio show, and it was, weekly, and so, it's kind of typical. You had your musical, it's kinda a dedication show. You do people could request songs and all that, and then I think you had a segment that was tied to like inmate profiles, topical issues going on, and then tell a story about the kind of the you dealt with what Big Moose, and you had the MF print
Yeah,
shop,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
then
yeah.
Stairway to Heaven. How did Stairway to Heaven get into that?
These guys sat there. I was so amazed. I remember the two guys right now. They were so excited to show me. Like I said,
Hmm.
they really were good. They knew how to work the print shop, and
Yeah.
but they had all this time on their hands, right? So they
Hmm.
present me with a dedication form. And I had
Hmm.
to make sure, but I was just me, so I had to make sure this got out to everybody. This had to be
Right. Right.
fair and
Hmm.
legit, right? And because we had the the mafia, you had the Afro, and you had the
Hmm.
JCs, and I had to
Hmm.
make sure that everybody, because we had an incredible coalition, but we got out there, and it's exactly as you said. We'd have news and really, significant news, but then also these profiles, and there's this one. It's just you don't forget this stuff. Uh, this guy Big, and he's a very nice guy, but this guy named Big Moose, and he was head of a bike gang called ECMF, East Coast Motherfuckers,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
but
right.
and then he also fashioned himself as kind of an artist. So he's just a very interesting guy. There are some interesting characters. As you and I are talking, there were some guys there that were just brutal thugs. Period. End of
Yeah,
story.
exactly.
Quite a few of them. But there are some interesting characters, and I'll tell you what, Ralph Ben David is. It's too bad he had a drug problem, but we became incredible friends. he and his son and my foster son and I ended up moving to Arizona. And
Yeah.
but he was one of the most brilliant guys. He had this strategy. They would do this. Check this out.
Mhm.
He's finding these class action suits. Well,
Yeah.
one cool little thing he found out that in those days, if there was a civil rights complaint, the FBI had to investigate. So
Yeah.
they would find all these little things, and they would file complaints. And pretty soon the FBI, they got to drag their tails down to the stupid prison every day. And pretty
Mhm.
soon they told the warden, hey, cut the shit, you're
Yeah.
killing us here. And so that's a little tactic. But they would file these class action suits and you gotta get the signatures, right? And
Mhm.
they got had signatures from guys who were in total solitary. They're supposed to be totally incommunicado, and they turn up with these, and the authorities had no idea how they did it, right? So I
Right.
mean, they pulled some magic tricks there, but they were very clever, and they had some brilliant lawyers. Even well, even I told you, even William Kunstler ended up defending Jerry Ouimet, but they
Mm.
had, but Ralph was a strategic genius, he really was, and this Raymond Patine he went there, check this out, he went down there on his own one day, and he
Yeah.
went there, and he looked around, and he said it was just beyond disgusting, the
Mhm.
vile filth
Yeah.
and then the conditions and everything, and he made the exact quote, says, "What I've seen here shocks the conscience." And
Yeah.
then so he was transformed. He says, look, of course you got to lock them up, and they should be. And then believe me, I know him well enough to know that a lot of those guys definitely need to be locked up. But they're still human beings. And so he's the first judge. He was the chief district judge, federal district court judge in Rhode Island, and he's the first judge in America to ever make that statement. So it was. So Ralph had an ally there, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense, and then I got a question. So you were, around this time in '71, you had the Attica prison riot, and that affected a lot. I know that was a state prison with New York, but that really affected a lot that was going on, with prison. It created a lot regarding prison reform because you had 43 guys that got killed. There was, including 10 correctional officers and employees, and so what was your I know you'd mentioned something about the Attica prison riot. What can you talk about on
Absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Good point. No, that really set the tone for everything. It
Yeah.
was horrific. And in those days, I think since that time they developed more structures between walls and bars and all that. But
Yeah.
yet way too many people running around loose. And the thing is you had
There's a lot
really
of overcrowding
hardcore
also, I think, right?
total overcrowding, and the
Mhm.
prison population were really hardcore guys from New York City, right? And here they are in rural Attica, New York, with these rural white guys. The culture clash was just beyond belief,
Yeah.
and they just didn't have good security procedures. The thing went wild. The inmates took over the place,
Mhm.
and then finally, but here's the thing that you're getting to is that so this really set the tone. The people said once Attica happened, they said, okay, something's got to happen. We
Yeah.
this obviously this is crazy for both sides. It's just nuts.
Right.
And but what happened was they finally regained control of the prison,
Yeah.
and I had the good fortune had an hour-long interview with this guy named Julian Tepper. There were citizen observers who were in
Mhm.
there because they're trying to put some oil on the water,
Yeah.
and so this guy Julian Temper, I got him on the air. It was the first time in the country that anybody heard this. But what happened was, yes, there were all these guys who died, correctional officers, inmates. But at the end, there was a whole bunch of them, and they had been recaptured, totally immobilized,
Mhm.
bound, gagged, couldn't even move a finger. And so he
Yeah.
walked by, he saw with his own eyes. He walked by and said, okay. He came back half an hour later, they had all been brutally massacred. It was a bloody mess. They
Mm.
just they just shot them and killed them where they sat. They couldn't even move. And so that was that was pretty amazing. But then so then what happened from that, James, is that they did try to at the time. they tried to use this idea of citizens being in there to kind of calm things down a little bit.
Yeah,
And
right.
there was in Walpole, which is the biggest maximum security in Massachusetts, just north of there.
Yeah.
It got pretty rough, and
Mhm.
so I was pretty busy with Providence, but friends of mine had gone up and they did that citizen observer thing in Walpole. And
Yeah.
I told you the story. And so, they're there and they just kinda talk to him, try to keep things cool, and it was positive, it helped for the time being. And, so this one guy was in there, one guy I knew, we're having beers, and he says, "Yeah, I was down there," and he says, "Well, I'm there," and I engaged, and this guy, just a really bright guy, and we just had a
Mhm.
great conversation about all kind of stuff, and heck, we're talking for about 45 minutes, just really incredibly intelligent guy. And then the guy, when they got done, the guy turned and walked away, and he saw on the back of his shirt it said "A DeSalvo." It was the
Mhm.
Boston Strangler.
Oh my gosh.
And so
Yeah.
these guys are Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Yeah, yeah, most definitely, and so going back to so you're there working in Rhode Island, you're working with the MPRA, you've got you have, these guys, from the Patriarcha family and, even beyond Patriarcha family, you have other mobsters, you have gang members, you have people, Irish, all different types of people you work with, and so I'd like for you to kinda summarize some of the people that you worked with, some of the inmates that were in the mob. I mean, some of them were associates, some of them were made, and that's fine. But then, talk about kind of the main guys you work with, but then maybe segue from that into Project Beginning, because that was a pretty
Perfect,
crazy story
perfect,
too.
perfect. Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. The main guy in running the operation there was Nick Palmisano.
Yep.
And he looked like something out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon with the
Hmm.
thickest the thickest, swarthiest beard, stocky, tough guy, but
Yeah.
total loyalist. He was the head of the Lifers Association.
Yeah.
And in the penitentiary, the guys that are lifers have the most juice because they got nothing to lose, So he was running the show and he became the head of the MPRA when they established it.
And he
And
was
so he
also a
called
hitman, just letting people know real
absolutely.
fast that he was a big hitman for, Raymond Patriarca. In fact, during the '70s, he might have been his, most maybe his closest, hitman. And in fact, when Patriarcha got in trouble, and I did a short on this the other day, but there was a secret arrest of Patriarcha, and it was all involving two murders that Parmigiano was accused of doing. Is all about him, and so we can talk about that part later. But the point was, I just want to mention how important Nick was to Raymond Patriarca. So sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt you. I just wanted to throw
Oh
that
yeah,
out there.
absolutely. Nick there in
Yeah.
Maximum, they trusted him to run the MPRA.
Yeah.
He was the main guy. He really was, and I got
Yeah.
along fine with him. I mean, I knew who he was and what he was, but but he contacted me, and he and I sat down to give the first publicity ever to the MPRA, and it was the most effective prison reform organization there ever was in this country.
Yep.
And keep
Mhm.
in mind, it's across 5 states. The only other one that really existed at the time was the Prisoners Union in California, and that was just in California.
Right.
But this thing, it was fascinating. So Nick was in charge, and so that was fine. But the guy that I told you about this, so it was Irish, but it was also as I say Maurice Pro Learner, who was Jewish,
Mhm.
and Jerry Ouimet, very famous, and he was French Canadian. This town called
Yeah.
Woonsocket, which is mostly French Canadians around there.
Yeah. Right.
And Jerry Women, I told you, I said, sometimes you hear a phrase, and then all of a sudden you meet somebody and you understand it. When you
Mhm.
say somebody's got ice water in their veins, when you meet Jerry Womet, there's nothing else there. And
Wow.
so seriously, what happens? I was crazy, but he would joke around that this guy from URI, Mike Jacobson, we're in a room there, and there's some young ladies there, and he
Yeah.
has his guys get on either side of him just by a,
Mhm.
a nod of his head. And then he looks at him and says, "Pants him," and he's terrified. And he was joking around with him, but he was not that far from joking around, right?
Mhm.
And but Jerry was in total control. Then one time Kathy Hoffman's there, and at the time she was my colleague, also my girlfriend, and
Mhm.
he made some just terrible, rude, disrespectful comments. I can't remember the exact words right now,
Right.
but it was just
Mhm.
really terrible. And with my crazy self, I says, Jerry, I'd really like to talk with you. And so Jerry very nicely set up so he and I are having a private conversation in an interview room. I
Yeah.
wasn't sure this was going to end well, right? And
Mhm.
I said, Jerry, this is not good. Hey, my good luck. He was in a good mood that day. He says,
Mhm.
"I guess I humor this dumb college kid and not make a big deal out of it."
Yeah.
But he used to seriously run, pizza and cold cuts and even pot and alcohol, and he'd have it delivered up to the medium security was easier to get in and out of, but he'd have it
Yeah.
there, and he'd have the guards deliver all this stuff. There is a picture, which you've seen, I think, where
Yeah.
when William Kunstler was there, they had a catered dinner that they fashioned for him and a bunch of the guys to have a
Yeah.
fancy dinner right there in the penitentiary. So
Yeah.
they didn't.
That's just
It was
crazy.
not the usual prison experience.
Yeah, and then you started working with the project, with the some of the programs there, and so there was, I guess, part of it was there was going to be some funding, maybe some funding from different sources, public and maybe private as well, and so can
And
you
this is yeah.
talk about how
No,
the
this is
mob wanted to try to work with you and they
exactly,
saw an
exactly.
opportunity?
Yeah, this is a good project. And by the way, there's a guy named Charlie Forts. And then we say black and Providence, a lot of times you're talking about Cape Verdean. They come from
Yeah.
the islands off of Africa. And this is a guy named Charlie Forts who really came off the docks in New Bedford. But he was
Mhm.
one of the best people you'd ever want to meet. But he
Wow.
was very quietly, he was the brains behind the scene. And there's
Yeah.
another guy named Larry Schwartz. But they came up and they said, this really was intelligent. They said, hey, if these guys are going to, if you want them to stay out of prison, you need to give them an opportunity to have a job and make a living, which
Yeah.
isn't easy.
Mhm.
And so they did that, and this thing's developing. And I'm the one who's got time. I've been around, and I know everything that's going on. And so Nick calls me in, and his number two guy is a guy named Ron Williams, black,
Mhm.
as a matter of fact, and not really with the Afro crew, but he was black, and and they wanted to talk to me.
Mhm.
And so they're sitting there and they say we're getting to launch this thing. And for some reason they thought, and this is the clash you have between the idealistic vision reformers and the hardcore mafia
Alright.
guys that are
Yeah.
top down authoritarian.
Yeah.
And they thought they needed to have this just for their people that they designated. They wanted to control the thing. And I was resisting. I thought this should be for everybody, which is
Yeah,
just
in the
makes sense
prison,
to
it
me.
would be yeah, the mob thought, "Oh, well, this just be a program for the mob guys and not everyone," and because
Exactly.
they saw an end thinking there would be, some, money or being able to get at least, things could benefit in prison for 'em.
Well, and then every one of those guys would figure that they personally owed the mob, not
Mhm,
just the organization, right? And so
mhm,
so so that was at play. But so they called me in and we're sitting there and Nick says, "Now, Mike, let's just say, and let's just say you're running the program and you're making maybe 100, which was a fortune in those days. And you're making maybe 100,000, 150,000 a year, Then I start chuckling. Come on. This is not happening. And
yeah,
so I says, please understand, before you get any ideas, there's Luella Russell and this other guy, and they know everything that's going on here. This is not just me. But it's
mhm,
just it's not gonna go that way.
yeah,
But when we ended up getting it started, there were
mhm,
two of us that ended up being the job developers. Me and
yeah,
this guy named Bill Bellamy. Bell was since he was a felon, he couldn't do any interviews, so I had to do all the interviews for the whole penitentiary. And
oh,
so I write a letter, and so I had you write a letter. Hey, we're recommending you parole so and so, and he will have our assistance in gaining in finding meaningful employment, da da da. But there's this
Mhm.
one guy named Dougie Gomes. The Gomes family were related to Ralph. They're Ralph's cousins. And this is the biggest, toughest, meanest, scariest guy you ever saw in your life. And
Mm.
so here I am writing a letter, right? This
Mhm.
guy's mama didn't think he should be paroled. Okay.
Can
And
you
so
imagine that? Wow, that is
and this
bad.
guy, I mean, nobody thought he should be paroled. But it turns so I wrote him, I says, well, if you should let him go, we'll help him. I mean, it was a different letter, right? He
Mhm.
got the letter I wrote for him, and another letter. He got me alone in that office up there. He's
Mhm.
hovering over me. I thought he was gonna explode on I thought that was gonna be my last minute on earth because he was so mad. He was ready to just absolutely just unload on me. So fortunately, he didn't actually touch me, but it was a miracle. But he was the ultimate bad guy,
Yeah,
and it was just crazy. It's crazy.
yeah. What about what was the challenge house?
Challenge House, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah,
And then this gets into the story. Uh, so Challenge House was set up as a halfway house in South Providence,
yeah,
and all hardcore maximum security guys. And it came to a time I ended up being the only staff person from midnight to 8:30 in the morning
okay.
with some of the hardest core felons. Now, and at that time period, most of them were trying to work, so a lot of them would just go to bed, and I'd have to wake them up in the morning and such.
Yeah,
But even when I went for the interview, there's a payphone. Of course, there were no cell phones in those days. There was a
right.
payphone, and there was this wood wall there, and there were all
Mhm.
these bullet holes. And this
Oh my
leads
god.
into the main story.
Yeah,
What had happened was, uh, as I said, the deniability of the Godfather is rule number one, and
yeah,
particularly for Raymond after what
yeah.
he had been through, and all
Mhm.
these guys disappoint him, right?
Yeah,
And so his number one thing were stand up guys.
yeah,
But what happened was he had been in the penitentiary in Atlanta. So a lot of the guys at the ACI had never even seen him. They knew of him, but they hadn't even seen him because he'd been down in Atlanta for years. He hadn't been
yeah,
locked up
yeah.
at the ACI.
Right, right.
All of a sudden, he's coming back. They brought him back for some legal thing, and he's at the ACI at lunchtime. And so he walks in there, and of course, he's the Godfather. Of course, he walks the head of the line and helps himself, right? There
Mhm.
are four black guys standing around there,
Yeah.
and one of them, and I couldn't tell you exactly who it was, one of them is pissed off, turns around, backhand smacks Raymond Patriarca, said, "The fuck you doing, you guinea bastard?" And then
Oh,
smacked him and physically smacked the hell out of him. In front of an entire audience like that. Is there anything worse? And so, of course, they
wow.
couldn't be sure which black guy it was in
Yeah,
typical racist fashion. And so they basically, but on the other hand, he couldn't actually put a hit out because it was so obvious. There was nobody in between him and the action that occurred, right? And
yeah.
so what they did, it was an indirect thing, and they just let it be known that this was an obvious, a horrendous insult to the Godfather. So if somebody took care of business, it would be very favorable for them.
Oh
And
my
what
god.
happened was, so Teddy Green was this guy who was at Challenge House, right?
Yeah.
And so he was there, and he was one of the four guys, and he was there, and they said, "Hey Teddy, you got a phone call,"
Mm,
and there was a window there near
mhm.
the phone, and as soon as he picked up that phone, he got his whole stomach got aerated, and
Yeah.
he had so much lead in his belly they couldn't close him up for weeks. They tried to
Oh
get
my
all the
god.
bullets out of there, and
Wow.
so he took that, and then it came down to Ralph,
Mhm.
and Ralph got betrayed again. The Gomes. This guy Archie Gomes was this guy was a piece of work,
Yeah.
and he was kind of funny, but he was crazy. And so he and this guy Delbert McClinton trapped Ralph. He suckered him into showing up at this place, and Ralph, even though he didn't do it, but
Yeah.
Ralph ended up with a bullet hole, hand to gun, a bullet hole in each leg, broken arm, broken ribs, and a broken nose. Okay.
Mm.
So he was a mess. And then
Yeah.
the thing was, of course, with the any gunshot wound, a doctor anywhere has to immediately report to authorities, right?
Yeah,
And of course,
exactly.
that was the case in Rhode Island. So if you can believe this, we took him to the hospital, and as soon as the doctor did that, we started to go to the other side of the hospital. By the time couldn't have been half an hour. By the time we got to the other side of the hospital, he calls this Ginger, who was the girlfriend of Nikki Bianco and also
Yep.
Ralph's girlfriend. Okay,
Oh
so
my Oh?
this is a strange relationship.
Yeah.
But
Oh my gosh.
Ginger said, and here's where we got the news. Ginger says, Ralph, they know you're at the hospital. So the word had got to the police. It had already
Yeah.
gotten to Nikki Bianco in Connecticut and to Ginger, if you can believe how quick that happened. And he
Mm.
said, they know you're not a problem because he'd been locked up for years. They knew he wasn't going to snitch on the Godfather, you know.
Yeah.
They says, they're not too sure about this guy, Mike. They don't know about him. He might have to
Oh.
take a ride. That was the
Mhm.
exact words. Taking a ride would mean you go to northern Rhode Island, and unless they
Yeah.
hear exactly what they feel like, nobody ever
Mhm.
sees you again. And
Yeah.
so
Oh my
that's
gosh.
what I was faced with. And they came down finally, and they said, you know, it might not be a bad idea to get out of town.
Yeah.
So Ralph and I had a sister here in Phoenix, and I thought
Mhm.
it might be a nice time to visit her.
Yeah.
And so Ralph and I were, but where our sons were still back there, but Ralph and I got out here and thought it'd be a pretty nice place to move to, which it
Yeah.
turned out to be.
Definitely is, yeah. Oh my gosh, and, so you
So
moved and you've been in, Arizona ever since, right?
pretty much I was back in Ohio for a while,
Uh-huh.
but with the business, but yeah, most of that time I've been here and but I was young and outgoing and
Yeah.
liked to drink a few beers and such, but I just knew I'm pretty talkative sometimes.
Yeah.
And I just knew that I could not ever say a word about them.
Yeah.
50
Oh my
years
god.
ago, I knew that I could not I had to train myself because particularly you got a few beers in you, your
Yeah.
lips can get a loose, you can let
Yeah,
anything
right.
slip. I said, I just can't. It's survival,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so all these years, I just had to maintain that. But I think the story
All they
it's
need
got
was a
I
subtle threat, and you knew they were
yeah,
being serious, because yeah, that's why it is, that's a loose end, they don't want anyone that could, especially they don't really know them that well, they won't,
yeah, yeah.
so, I mean, I think you made the right decision, and, you were talking about Pro Werner, and that's an interesting guy, that, there's a guy named Vincent Teresa back in '78,
Vinnie Teresa,
he
yeah.
yeah, he ended up testifying. He turned. And so he claims that back in 1960 that the CIA got close to Patriarcha, you know, Patriarcha Senior. And basically the CIA gave $4 million to Raymond. It was a contract to have his best guy go down and murder Fidel Castro.
Oh,
And
wow, okay.
And so Pro Werner was going to be the guy to do that. But somehow at the end the plot never got carried out. And so I don't know whatever happened to the
Oh,
money,
Pro
if he
Learner
had
was
to
gonna be that
return it
guy,
or
huh? I
not.
never heard that.
Yeah, yeah, that just was during there was a and I don't even know if it's true, this guy Vincent is Teresa was one saying that it happened, but basically saying in 1960 that CIA was working with Patriarcha and gave him $4 million to have his best guy go down and take him out. And he claims it was Pro Werner that was the one. But, I don't, who knows
I
if
can
it's
see it.
true, but it's a great story, though.
Well, it is, and Pro Learner was he was low key, quiet guy,
Yeah.
and I got that Raymond trusted him. That he was like a special guy, and he wasn't
Yeah.
just running around running his mouth whatsoever. You know, it was a different deal.
Yeah,
But
most
I tell you
definitely.
what else was amazing, James, is,
Yeah.
with the MPRA, and keep in mind, the board of directors is in
Mhm.
maximum security, okay? And
Yeah,
that representing Jericho Society, I sat on that board and I was very involved. And but it's running from inside maximum security.
yeah,
And but they really, you find everybody always tries to do in politics anywhere they try to have a coalition and keep it
yeah,
together, and it usually doesn't work. But here you are in a penitentiary, which is the easiest place to have divide and conquer because
yeah,
people are in different cell blocks and all that, different ethnic groups. And so
yeah.
the easiest thing in the world is to divide them and turn people against each other. These guys did the most amazing job that I've ever seen of keeping it together. I mean, apart
Mhm.
from the incident we just talked about, but they recognize that they benefited from Ralph's brilliance in the courtroom.
Yeah.
They
Wow.
he gave them rights that they didn't couldn't even dream. They couldn't even dream of having those rights. And on
Mm.
the other hand, the Afro by itself, without the muscle of the mob, they
Yeah,
couldn't do anything big. And so the two of them and the JCs, which were the other white inmates, they made absolute unity and they stuck together. And as you rightly point out, then it came back to that project beginning because
mhm.
once it turned out that that was for everybody, that was a real thing. I mean, that gives guys get out of prison, all of a sudden they got hope. And I was able to do that. This guy, I was trained by a guy named Paul Orlando. This guy named Eddie Beard, who became the congressman. He was a painter, just a
Mhm.
regular old blue collar painter, and he got elected to Congress in Rhode Island. And
Yeah.
Paul Orlando was going to go work for him. He took me out and trained me on how to do this. And he said, I'll never forget. He says, Mike, he says, no such thing as a bad guy or a bad job. It's the
Hmm.
match. It's the match you put together between the two.
Yeah.
And one guy, Ralph Ponton, worked one on one with the owner of this glass company. They
Yeah.
became great friends. They helped each other. But
Yeah.
the one guy that was he was a hitman named Georgie the Crab Damus. I can
Oh,
picture him
that's a
right
great
now.
nickname, isn't
And
it?
I mean, that was his thing. He was killing
Yeah.
people. It was just that's what his job was.
Mm.
And so I literally placed him in a Dunkin' Donuts. He would go in, lock himself in. He was all by himself, so there
Yeah.
was nobody there to kill. What he
Yeah,
did
he
piss
was a
off
guy
others,
you
I
could
have no
not have him
idea.
around people, could you?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Lead me not into temptation, right?
Oh
And
my
so he did fine, but it was a good program. I was proud of it, and we are able to basically get a lot of those guys into some decent jobs and give them a chance. You can't guarantee anything, but it was interesting.
Did you find it interesting too? I was thinking back at what you were saying, you look at today with organized crime and all of the most of the mobsters they seem they're pretty, conservative and all that and they don't like a lot of the progressive stuff, but wasn't it interesting how some of these progressive programs how the mob was involved with you in that, and it just seemed to and they benefited. They got educated. There was things that helped them, but, you wouldn't think that a progressive program like that, that organized crime would be part of that, involved with it,
That's you put your finger on that's what's amazing about this and,
Yeah.
and unique, and I really appreciate the chance to try to explain it
Yeah.
that they found common cause with each other.
Mhm.
They knew they benefited from Ralph's brilliant legal strategy, and they knew. I mean, some of the top guys had food coming in and stuff, but it was still a disgusting place. And so the thing was, what Ralph brought them through this. They had rights.
Yeah.
Okay, the
Mhm.
disciplinary committee,
Yeah.
what was it? Status committee, and
Mhm.
before they would just move these guys whenever they wanted. They never
Yeah.
had due process. They never had hearings.
Right.
And
Right.
when you got these Patine rules in there, they had a right to stand up for themselves. They had the
Mhm.
right to have a hearing if they're going to be moved from medium to maximum. If
Yeah.
and they did not have the right to be just sent out of state. They used to do that all the time. If it was
Yeah.
inconvenient, they just lug a guy away from his family and everything. And
Yeah.
so there were whole there were that's what happened. Ralph was able to, and really I give Ralph the credit because he was the leader and
Yeah.
but they were able to deliver tangible things to these mafia guys
Yeah.
that they recognized was in their interest. And at the
Mhm.
same time, Ralph with the afro, he didn't have the muscle to bring
Right.
in the jobs program you know, all these other things that
Yeah.
but that I've never seen something stay together as tightly as that. But they found common cause and they found a way to help each other and make it stick.
It surprised me. I remember when I first asked you about Ralph Ben David, I figured I thought he was, Jewish, just Jewish guy, but you're saying he's African American black, right?
Yeah, Cape Verdean, and there was some Jewish blood there some way,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Mike Van Leesten also in Providence, who's the head of the OIC, the big training organization, wonderful guy. He had Dutch blood, but there was some Jewish blood there, so who knows,
yeah,
some of the stuff how it comes about, but like I
yeah,
said, you got different elements, but most of the mob guys obviously were traditional Italian, but you have these different cases that make it interesting.
yeah, and Ralph was really kind of the guy that you worked with mostly, in the program, right?
Yeah, we're great friends, and I said his son and my foster son and I and we're the ones that and we got after we came back from here, we put
Mhm.
everything we had in a U-Haul and drove all the way out
Mm,
here, and
yeah,
and found sunny skies, and so it worked out, and
yeah,
but no, it's unfortunate. I mean, he's a drug. He would never do drugs around me. He respected me too much, and when he
mhm,
finally gave up and did that, he went away because he
yeah,
had too much respect for me. But he
yeah,
held off as long as he could, and it's too bad because he had just a brilliant legal mind.
wow,
It's like I said, to this day, these 50 years later, these precedents that he came out of his brain are in
mhm,
force and have power. You know,
and this is what started, a lot of the prison reform today wouldn't have happened without him, that's
it's
something
true.
that people don't realize, and that was part of the reason I wanted you to come on because you have this real interesting story, but it also uh, it didn't end there. The benefit of this is was a catalyst for what we're seeing with prison reform today. You go from what happened in Attica, it was just horrible, 43. And, prison reform, we're not where we need to be, obviously. But there are little points of light throughout the criminal justice system that trying to do things right. And you are seeing some people benefit. So it's one of those things I guess you have to do, help people, you know, a little at a time, but at least the trajectory is maybe a little better or it was, and so, you know, we'll we'll see what happens, but
Well, yeah,
I have a
I
lot of
agree with you.
respect for
I,
him.
Yeah, I think you'd have to say it's more civilized. On the other
Yeah.
hand, what's happened is rather than state bureaucracies, you've got some massive corporations, Corrections Corporation of
Yeah, that's
America,
the big
Core
change,
Civic,
right?
and they make these private prisons, and it's more difficult to look over their shoulder and to really demand accountability. And and when you do, you end up paying twice. But that's
Mhm.
it's been more easy to do the private things, but it is everybody looked at Attica. And by the way, the Hayward Burns was the lawyer who became involved in the movie.
Yeah.
I got to
Yep, yep,
interview
yep.
him as
Mhm.
well. Brilliant guy. He said, I never forget the first time I saw him, impeccable in a pinstripe suit. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with a system of criminal justice in this country that is unfortunately is far more criminal than it is just." You know,
Yeah,
just
that's
a
true.
brilliant guy, and but Attica, I mean, that was a wake up call to everybody. Everybody looked at that and said, "Oh my God," you know. And
Yeah,
so, thankfully, as you said, from that moment, people said, "Wait, no matter what your beliefs were, that was just beyond the pale." And
yeah.
from that point, at least they put a cap on the violence and the brutality. You know.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely, and but yeah, I mean, I just really I think you really have a just it's an important story too. I wanted this to get out, and I just I appreciate all of your honesty. Everything is checked out, and I just it means a lot to me. And so, tell me a little. Just there's a couple of stories maybe that I think are interesting. Maybe I think the audience was like, "Can you talk about Scotty and Al Capone?"
Oh man, that's funny. And it's a totally different story, but to me, it's just that you can't make it up. So
Yeah.
there's this wonderful woman. I was when I was down here in Phoenix, I was on the Juneteenth committee, and we,
Hmm.
and wonderful group of people, and every year we put on the Juneteenth celebration at the East Lake Park.
Yeah.
And there's this lady. This lady took up martial arts when she was in her 80s.
Mm.
She was a firecracker, but when
Yeah.
she started out, she was just a gorgeous light-skinned black woman, and she
Hmm.
was ran the elevator for Al Capone for 4 years. The elevator, right?
Yeah.
So she saw every single person that came and went. There were no automatic elevators, right? You had a
Hmm.
person had to manually operate it.
Yeah.
And so she did, and just a lovely person, just hey, she's the kind of person you love to talk to and so on. So the
Yeah.
4 years she had done that, but she's still a young woman. She's looking forward to her life. And she goes to Al Capone one day. She says, Al, I appreciate the job, but I'm gonna be taking off here pretty soon. He says, well, you can't do that. You know way too much. It's
Hmm.
impossible. She goes, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to do it. And so she says, well, he says, I tell you what, you can go ahead, but if I hear one peep, that's all. One peep, that's it.
Mhm.
And so, as it turned out, he gave that. He thought he was putting his foot down. She lived 61 years longer than he did.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And she lived to be 109. We had
Yeah.
a birthday party for her when she was 105. But when
Yeah.
she was this is a cute story. When, this, other couple, we took her to dinner at, Red
Mhm.
Lobster on her
Yeah.
93rd birthday. And so I ran over the other guys already had their drinks, and I went over to get a drink for her and me. And this
Mhm.
guy, very serious, says, "Well, I need to see an ID for that other person." I just started laughing. He says,
Mhm.
"What's so funny?" He says, I said, "The young lady that drinks for, as a matter of fact, she's turning 93 today." So the word got around pretty quickly, and, at the
Mhm.
end when they bring around the birthday cake and clap
Yeah.
and sing and
Right.
everything,
Mhm.
when the word had gotten out, everybody came out of the kitchen everywhere. They had to see this 93-year-old chick who was who was getting a drink,
Mhm.
and then the famous one is, as we're sitting around there, we had a just everybody just loaded up with some planning the Juneteenth again, and,
Yeah.
good barbecue, and we're just getting ready to eat, and she says, "I don't wanna hold you up, but I just wanna say one thing. I'm here in the room with my best friends in the world, and don't get it twisted. I'm feeling okay, nothing wrong with me. I just want y'all to know that whenever I do go, I wanna be buried face down."
Mm.
We're looking around, well, what is she face I don't even understand what she's talking about. She says, "Well,
Yeah.
I figure like this. My friends already know me and love me, and everybody else can just walk by and kiss my ass."
Oh my god. She
So,
was
I
a
mean,
feisty one, wasn't she?
she was up by some
Oh
there's
my
nothing mean about her, but she's
no,
just
no,
funny
no.
as
Just,
hell.
it had a lot of personality, right?
I
So
think I think I sent you a picture. She really was
yeah,
a lovely young lady and just,
she was.
yeah,
Yeah.
and her at that 105th birthday party, and she was joking at this point because she
Oh,
was
yeah.
105, but she's
Yeah.
at the end of the party, and she went around talking to everybody at every table. She says, "Oh, come on, let's go bar hopping." She was kinda kidding, but not by
Yeah.
too much. I mean, she was just a phenomenon, you know?
Yeah. No, no, it's just that's a great story, and, I just is there a couple of things before we go? I wanted people, if they have an opportunity to if they wanna connect with you, what's the best way to connect with you? And, I'll make sure to, you know, can they send you an email or
I suppose, yeah, we could share an email address, and
okay.
I can get that to you. I've got a couple, but I can get one that would be dedicated that would be for
Yeah,
this, and
I can do Okay, Mike, thank you so much for being here. I love all these stories. I mean, you lived a real interesting time to be honest, being around these guys and you survived. I think that's the most important thing. You were
Still
able to
here
survive all that, right?
so far.
Yeah, so far.
And, and I appreciate James because, I've become aware that there's certain things in your life that you think,
Mhm.
oh, people for sure are going to remember this. But
Yeah,
unless you tell the truth, unless you tell a story, it gets lost sometime. And I think these stories are significant enough, and the way they're able to work together and really, do something big for prison reform and so on.
yes,
There's some stories there that I felt needed to be told, and I really appreciate your help and your facilitating to be able to
yeah.
get this out and share this with people, and hopefully people take it to heart.
Yeah, well, it was my pleasure. I mean, I'm just honored for you being here, and so I just um, ask all of you to, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Also, I want to hear your comments. Please give us your comments. Mike will be in the comments to answer if there's anything you want to say to Mike, or reach out to him. Put a comment out there, and we'll make sure that we get everything answered. And again, thank you very much, and hope that you can be back again.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, James.
Hey, thank you, Mike, and then for everyone else. Just thanks for watching. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.